Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. When it comes to how we worship God, who decides what we're going to do? Us, God, and the worship leader in our church? Well, today in our study of Leviticus 10, we're going to read about Nadab and Abihu who offered strange fire to the Lord. And not only did this not please the Lord, it brought his wrath and judgment upon them. So welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. My name is Russ Brewer, and we're going through the key chapters of the Bible, the ones that we really need to know in order to understand the message of God. And today we're studying Leviticus 10, which shows us the holy, reverent attitude we are to have when we come before the Lord. And this chapter establishes once and for all who decides how we'll worship the Lord. Now, as we come to Leviticus 10, this is our sixth day in the study of the book of Leviticus. So far, we've been wading into the Levitical law and how to offer sacrifices to the Lord. It's been clear that the worship of God is not a free-for-all. There are specific ways in which God is to be honored. And the underlying point of this whole study has been that we can't approach God on any terms other than the ones that He has prescribed. This goes all the way back to Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and Noah, or even when God called Moses and made him circumcise his son in Exodus 4. We've seen time and again that God is not a game, and we can't do just whatever we want and call that worship. Instead, we are called to listen to God and follow His instructions. That's the heart of true worship. True worship worships God in spirit and truth. It is the demonstration of our submission to God, where we live out the reality that God is God and we are not. And because He is God, He calls the shots. And because He's the authority, we're saying to Him, I'll do what you say and not what I think, because you're in charge and I'm not. The underlying point of this whole study is that we can't approach God on any terms other than the ones that He has prescribed. This goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, and then Cain and Abel and Noah, or even when God called Moses and made him circumcise his son in Exodus 4. We've seen time and again that God is not a game. We can't do just whatever we want and call that worship. Instead, we are called to listen to God and follow His instructions. That's the heart of true worship. True worship worships God in spirit and truth. It is the demonstration of our submission to God, where we live out the reality that God is God and we are not. And because He's God, He calls the shots. And because He's the authority, we're saying to God, I'll do whatever you say and not what I think, because you're in charge and I'm not. Now, a lot of people hear this point and they recoil at it. And that's no surprise. It's never been popular, going all the way back to Cain. And so, throughout the book of Leviticus, God has been making it abundantly clear to ancient Israel that even though they are the chosen people of God, they did not have a right to make up worship of Him. God decides how we worship Him and not the other way around. And the event in Leviticus 10 teaches them this point once again through the tragic example of Nadab and Abihu. So let's talk about what happens in this chapter. If you've already read Leviticus 10, then you know it doesn't take long for Aaron's sons Nadab and Abihu to get destroyed by the Lord for offering strange fire to Him. In verse 1, they offer strange, unauthorized fire before the Lord. And in verse 2, fire comes from the presence of the Lord and kills them. Now, this probably seems abrupt, but we need to keep in mind that these opening verses come right after the joyful record in Leviticus 9 of the consecration of Aaron, his sons, and the rest of the people. And in chapter 9, they have this long celebratory ceremony, and they obey all the steps prescribed by the Lord. But in chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu choose to modify those steps, and they're destroyed for it. Now, why? Why were they destroyed? After all, they're worshiping the Lord. You'd think that God would be pleased. Instead, they're dead. Well, the answer to the question why goes back to the purpose of the Levitical priests. In fact, it's one of the fundamental purposes of the book of Leviticus and the Levitical priesthood. The Lord appointed the Levites to lead the people in worship as God's appointed priests. That's why God gave them this book. The book of Leviticus is the manual for the Levites and how to lead the people to worship God. Now, why do they have this role? The Lord appointed the Levites to lead the people in worship as God's appointed priests. That's why God gave them this book. The book of Leviticus is a manual for the Levites in how to lead the people to worship God. Now, why did they have this role? Well, originally, the firstborn of Israel were to lead the people in worship. But Exodus 32 records what happened when the people have it their way. They make that golden calf. And at the end of that chapter, the tribe who sided with Moses was the tribe of Levi. In fact, it's one of the first times that they're mentioned in the Bible. I mean, technically, they're mentioned here and there going all the way back to Genesis 29. But considering how important they are to the religious life of the Jews, we don't hear much about them until Exodus 32 and the golden calf. But then, after Exodus 32, the Levites become God's representatives to the people and the people's representatives to the Lord. And that's why they were to live among the rest of the people, serving as examples of what it looks like to obey their covenant with God. Now, you might remember that they didn't own their own tribal land, and that fulfilled Jacob's prophecy back in Genesis 49:7, where Jacob prophesied that the Lord would scatter them in Israel. And so then as we reflect upon the events of the golden calf and the Levites' obedience to the Lord and their scattered role throughout Israel in the book of Leviticus, we're seeing that the Levites were missionaries. They were ambassadors who lived among the people, calling the nation of Israel to obey their covenant with God. Therefore, it stands to reason that from among this tribe would come the priests. But here's the thing, not every Levite was a priest. It's true that every priest was a Levite, but not every Levite was a priest. The only true priests were those ordained to lead the people in worship. The priests were Levites who were specifically trained in the book of Leviticus to lead the people in the worship of the Lord. This Levitical priesthood was basically an ancient form of quality control. The incident of the golden calf in Exodus 32 demonstrated that if the people do whatever they want, they'll adopt the man-made religions around them and do whatever is culturally cool at the time. The priesthood was to make sure that didn't happen. Which then brings us back to Leviticus 10, when Nadab and Abihu offered this unauthorized fire before the Lord. This was a big deal, especially considering where this was in Israel's history and who this was in terms of Israel's leadership. Verse 1 tells us that Nadab and Abihu were the sons of Aaron. Now, you'll remember who Aaron was. He's Moses' brother. He's the guy who went with Moses to take on Pharaoh. He's the guy who did the majority of the talking. He's the guy who led all the people in the worship of the Lord. He's also the guy who was supposed to make sure that everything that we've been reading about was followed by the rest of the Levitical priests and stayed in alignment with God's instructions. And so Aaron was super important in the establishment of the nation of Israel and in the purity of her devotion to the Lord. And so you can imagine some of the prestige it would have been to be one of Aaron's sons. In fact, Aaron's sons were pretty important too. Their birth was specifically recorded back in Exodus 6:23. They were part of the 70 leaders who met with the Lord in Exodus 24. In Exodus 28:1, they were specifically appointed by God to be part of Israel's first priesthood. And just a couple chapters ago, back in Leviticus 8:1, the Lord told Moses to take Aaron and his sons and consecrate them to the priesthood, and Leviticus 9 records the whole ceremony where Aaron and his sons were consecrated. And so these guys are legitimate leaders. But it looks like all of this authority went to their head. And Aaron's two sons think they've got this whole worship of the Lord figured out. Just light a fire, burn an animal, not much to it. And so in verse 1, they go and they get a fire pan. Now, a fire pan is basically something that they had back then to keep embers burning so they could always light a fire. And so they get this fire going and they put incense on it and they offer it to the Lord as worship. Now, the ritual wasn't the problem. It was worshiping God with fire that did not originate with Him. The sacred fire that they were supposed to use came from God. And you see this at the very end of chapter 9. Here we are, we're in Leviticus 10:1, and Nadab and Abihu, they're offering this strange fire to the Lord. And the very last verse, effectively the verse that comes right before Leviticus 10:1, the very last verse of Leviticus 9, verse 24, where they just are finishing this ceremony of consecration, and verse 24 says, "Then fire came out from before the Lord and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar, and when all the people saw it, they shouted and fell on their faces." And so Nadab and Abihu were part of this crowd that saw this miraculous fire come from God, and they fell on their faces. And they see that there in Leviticus 9:24. But here we are just one verse later, and they choose to bring their own fire. Now this wasn't an oversight. Exodus 30 verse 9 specifically commands the people to not bring just any old fire before the Lord. Exodus 30 verse 9 says, "You shall not offer any strange incense on this altar, or burnt offering, or meal offering, and you shall not pour out a drink offering on it." And so they knew not to offer strange fire before the Lord. But what's strange fire? Strange fire is any fire that didn't originate from the sacred bronze altar that was lit by the Lord back in Leviticus 9:24. According to Numbers 3:4, no other fire was acceptable to the Lord. In fact, later, when Solomon built the temple which would replace the tabernacle, God also lit that fire in 2 Chronicles 7:1. Not only that, but we saw back in Leviticus 6:13 that this fire was to burn continuously as a constant reminder of God's presence, His holiness, and His power. Nadab and Abihu knew all this as God's appointed and consecrated priests, but still they disregarded the Lord and His commands. So here you have the start of the nation of Israel. They've just been delivered from Egypt. They saw God's warnings when Moses was on Mount Sinai to not even touch the mountain or they would die. They saw what happened in Exodus 32 with the golden calf, where the people did their own thing and they suffered greatly for it. And the Lord has been giving them all these specific instructions, constantly saying, this is holy, or this is dedicated just for the Lord, or this needs to be separated. And so you got all of this, and right out the gate, the leader's very own sons are disregarding the teaching of the Lord and making up their own form of worship. Now, why did they dishonor God this way? Well, later in verses 16 to 20, Aaron's other sons seem confused about some of the sacrifices, and perhaps these guys hadn't put the work in necessary to truly learn this stuff. And maybe Nadab and Abihu just really weren't that serious about learning the ways of God. There's possibly another hint also in verses 8 and 9. In verses 8 and 9, the Lord prohibits His servants from coming before Him having drunken any wine or strong drink. And perhaps Nadab and Abihu were under the influence of alcohol. Either way, we're seeing this serious mindset that we're to have when we approach the Lord. Nothing is to taint our judgment when it comes to our obedience to Him. And so, going back to Leviticus 10, this whole passage, it's unsettling. In our world where everything goes, we might celebrate these guys for their sincerity and their creativity and their ingenuity. We might even join with them. But clearly the Lord doesn't see it this way. And so in verse 3, Moses then turns to Aaron and basically says, "Remember that the Lord has said, 'By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people, I will be honored.'" Well, Aaron sees his point, doesn't say anything. And because a priest could not touch a dead body, in verses 4 and 5, the sons of Aaron's uncle take away the bodies of Nadab and Abihu. And this whole matter, it's so serious. In verses 6 and 7, Moses explains to Aaron and his sons that this was not a time to grieve the loss of Nadab and Abihu. This was a time to recognize how holy the Lord is and let nothing, not even the death of family members, keep them from serving the Lord. Moses then continues on and gives them some guidance about how to finish up their offering in a way that conforms to the Levitical instruction. In verse 12, Moses instructs Aaron's other sons, Eleazar and Ithamar, to eat the offering. Remember, we talked about that part of the ceremony back in Leviticus 2:3. Now, Eleazar and Ithamar were also priests, and the high priesthood would come through Eleazar. Now, it should have come through Nadab, but because of his sin, it's transferred to Eleazar. And here we're seeing that Eleazar and Ithamar, they eat this offering because it was clean and sacred and commanded by God. And then in verse 14, they're also to eat the meat of the wave offering. Remember from our study back in Exodus 30 that a wave offering was lifted up to the Lord and then given back to the worshiper. In this instance, because it's also a sin offering, Leviticus 6:26 says it was to be eaten by the priests. But that's not what happened. And so in verses 16 to 18, Moses is annoyed with Aaron and his sons because they let the sin offering burn up completely when it was supposed to be cooked and eaten. But Aaron suggests in verse 20 that it would be wrong to eat this meat as a celebration of forgiveness and communion with the Lord when his sons had so clearly violated these principles. And so Moses sees this point and the matter is put to rest. Now that's Leviticus 10. This key chapter gives us 3 clear principles. The first principle relates to the attitude that we're to have when we approach the Lord, specifically the seriousness that we need to have in our worship. Nadab and Abihu were consecrated priests, and because of their roles as priests, they didn't have the freedom to be cavalier with the things of God. Not that they were actually ever allowed to be cavalier with the Lord, but if they were to come before the Lord, He was to be their focus. You see this in the summary statement of the Lord in verse 3 after Nadab and Abihu were killed. Moses reminds Aaron that the Lord has already said, "By those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people, I will be honored." And so the priests were to lead the people in treating the Lord in a holy, sanctified manner. The nation would only rise to the spiritual level of the priests, and if they did not regard the Lord as holy and seek to be consecrated to Him, no one else would. Thus, the Lord even warns the priests about taking Him seriously back in Exodus 19:22 when He said, "Also, let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, or else the Lord will break out against them." And so the Lord is calling His leaders to lead in faithfulness, otherwise they will face His judgment. Along those lines, another key takeaway from this chapter is the summary given in verse 10, which says that the people were to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean. Now, in our modern day, we tend to treat everything the same. Generally speaking, we don't really hold some things as being more sacred than others. And yet, verse 10 reminds us of the principle of separation. And while we ought to bring the Lord and His holiness into every aspect of our life, not everything that we might think is holy truly is. And to discern this distinction, verse 11 calls Aaron to, it says, "Teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them through Moses." And that reminds us of the ultimate purpose of the priests, to teach and lead God's people to obey their covenant with Him. The final principle from this chapter relates to worship, and it deals with the question, who decides what is acceptable worship to the Lord? We tend to define worship as whatever makes me feel warm and cozy with God. We think of worship as an emotional feeling. But here we're seeing that true worship starts with obeying God. Worship, it's an eminently holy act of obedience, and it's possible to come before the Lord without any true worship at all. True worship is carrying out the principle that God is God and He's in charge, and we're here for Him to do what pleases Him. We don't make things up for ourselves. We're not the one who's being worshipped. God is. In the Old Covenant, they worship the Lord through all these rituals and ceremonies. And this may lead us to ask, is this still what we're supposed to do? Does God still want us to worship Him through ceremony? Well, some Christians might think so, and they might try to make up new ceremonies for God. But Leviticus 10 shows us that God is not calling us to make up our own ideas about worship. Not only that, we see it in the New Testament that these sacrifices, these rituals, these ceremonies were fulfilled in Christ, and it never tells us to make up new ones. So then how do we worship the Lord? Well, Jesus tells us in John 4:23 and 24 that the Father seeks true worshipers who will worship the Lord in spirit and in truth. God is calling us to worship Him in our spirit according to His truth. And so our spirit needs to be engaged, and we need to be following the things He has told us to do. The root meaning of the word worship is turn. Now, sometimes people say it's worth, where we celebrate God's worth. And while that's true, the meaning of worship, at least the English word worship, goes all the way back to turning, where we turn from ourselves and things of this world to worshiping and celebrating God's wisdom and the truth we know about Him. And so worship is focusing on and rejoicing in truth about God. This is the core idea that Hebrews 13 teaches about worship in the New Covenant. Listen to the following passage from Hebrews 13, verse 15. The author says, "Through Him then," and that's speaking of through Jesus, "through Him then, let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is, the fruit of lips that give thanks to His name." And so here, we're to continually be praising God. That's the fruit of our lips where we give thanks and praise to God. Now that phrase continually there, continually offer up a sacrifice of praise, that should remind us of the fires that will continually be burning before the Lord. And the phrase, the fruit of the lips that give thanks to His name, that should remind us of the grain offerings where the worshipers would celebrate God and give Him thanks for His abundant blessings in our life. And so, under the new covenant, we're all priests before the Lord. There are no longer Levites and sons of Aaron, but there are God's people continually offering the sacrifice of praise and thanks to Him. And so let's end with the question. Think about how you tend to spend your day. Are you continually offering praise and thanks to God? Or when was the last time you offered a sacrifice of praise to Him? If it's been a while, confess that to the Lord and let Him guide you to living a life fulfilling the worship He has called you to offer to Him. Well, with that, it's been great meeting with you today. I look forward to catching up with you tomorrow as we go into Leviticus chapter 16 and an incredible passage that unpacks the Day of Atonement, the Yom Kippur. Until then, have a great day